percentage of our overall energy consumption in Massachusetts. So we get about 12% of our electricity from renewable sources like solar and wind, and for heating and transportation, it's just far behind that. So we don't have a long way to go to actually.
Ben, I apologize. It's actually bad enough that I don't think most of us can understand you.
Oh, okay. Well, do you want to move on to Joel, and I could try to find maybe a better
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Okay.
Okay. So, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to Joel's slides, and we're going to try to come back to Ben because, as many of you are putting in the chat box, the sound is really bad. So, Joel, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we totally can. Okay, so we are on your slides, and we'll come back to Ben.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Technology is often difficult to make work properly. I am covering a couple of issues related to solar power today, solar energy. And if you're looking at the slides, as you can see, the topic here is really around access to solar energy. As Ben started to go into a little bit about the growth of renewable energy in Massachusetts and the quantity of clean energy which we have, which is in fact quite a lot. We are beating some much sunnier states in solar. But one of the key issues in thinking about our transition to a green economy is does everyone have access to the benefits of the clean energy future that we're trying to build, or the clean energy present for that matter? So one thing that we are trying to do here at Clean Water Action, where I work, and through coalitions like MassPower Forward, is advance renewable energy policies that work for everyone. So that means with energy efficiency, with weatherization, and with renewable energy, make sure that regardless of your economic class, your housing type, the geographic area you live in, how densely built the neighborhood you live in is, or for other reasons, regardless of those things, that you can still benefit from programs that we are creating statewide, and particularly because on our energy bills we pay into things like weatherization and incentives to support the development of solar. So it's really critical from a sort of an economic equity perspective that we ensure everyone has access to them. So MassPower Forward and the Green Justice Coalition, another coalition that we're working in sync with, have filed some legislation. If you can go to the next slide, Carol, that would be awesome. We have filed legislation to try to target some, not all, but some of the barriers related to solar access and equity. So the title and bill numbers of the legislation are there on the slide. And essentially, there's a couple of things we're trying to do. One, if you've been following solar policy in debates in the past couple of years, you'll see that we've gotten to a kind of impasse in Massachusetts. There's often a conversation about, is renewable energy too expensive? Are we subsidizing clean energy too much? And, well, is this only for homeowners? Is this only for the wealthy? And the problem with this conversation is twofold. One, often the people putting out these messages are folks who are inclined to actually suppress the growth of renewable energy. But the second problem is that there's a grain of truth, unfortunately, which is that, some people are benefiting more than others. And from our perspective, from Clean Water Action, from MassPower Forward, the answer isn't to just shut down renewable energy. We know we have to fight climate change. We know we have to advance renewable energy. The answer is to make sure that everyone actually benefits, and benefits equally, or as close to that as we can possibly get. So by focusing the conversation on how we get to the solutions that work for everyone, we want to change the dialogue around solar. But the actual policies in that, there's a couple of really specific ones that relate to that. Solar energy in Massachusetts and in many states, it revolves around a billing mechanism known as net metering. And if you're not familiar with this, the basic idea is that traditionally we've been going with your utility meter winds. As you use energy, it goes one way. With renewable energy, with customers sending power back to the grid, you basically have the meter winding backwards. So now we have not only differences in how the grid works, but we have sort of a more complicated accounting system. And so the basic idea you can think of is we had a one-way metering system, we had a one-way power direction, now we have two ways. The part of the debate around renewable energy is how much energy is worth. And you can calculate that in all kinds of different ways, but it comes down to a big debate around accounting. And that has real economic impact on whether renewable energy projects get built and how much people benefit from them. So Massachusetts enacted some cuts to to net metering in the past year that don't impact small rooftop solar, but do impact larger projects. And the ramifications of this are that if you need to access a solar project that's not on your roof, if you need to buy in because you can't put it on your roof, because you have a shaded roof, because you don't own your roof, you're a renter, if you need to buy into a project that's somewhere else, well, first of all, it's fortunate that we can do that kind of off-site, that virtual net metering, as it's called in Massachusetts. But now, if you go to do that, you're going to get a lower rate than someone who can put solar on their roof. So the so-called solutions that were put forward to address an issue of inequality actually made it worse. It widened the gap. And so we are looking at that issue about restoring some of the compensation for solar, not particularly for the developers, but for the parts of solar compensation that really are the most essential for customers, for people paying electricity bills. And to do that for low-income solar, and to do that for low-income housing projects, and so people who are on basically a low-income rate for multifamily housing projects, for certain kinds of service providers like a food bank, for example, to give them the rate of solar compensation we were at before. And also, because there are people who are not in poverty, but they're not wealthy, so there's a whole range of people who fall into the sort of, I would say, middle area of maybe don't have enough money, don't have a lot of spare cash, but aren't quite qualifying for government assistance. To pre-qualify a lot of folks who are in dense urban areas or environmental justice neighborhoods, if there's questions later, I can go in a little bit more about that, for this higher rate as well. So people essentially who are low or moderate income can get this compensation rate we were going with previously. This policy also has a boost to the net metering cap, which they limit on whether any projects that are of a certain size can get this full net metering compensation. So there's a couple overlay policies that are confusing, but the basic idea is that low and moderate income solar would get treated at a better rate of compensation, and that there would be more space for those larger projects to be built at all. I think if you can go to the next slide. This slide goes into just a little bit of what the different solar payments are. So I talked a little bit about net metering. This is complicated. There are not only different kinds of incentives that have been reduced, but there's also evolving incentives. So the SREC, the renewable energy credits, which is the primary incentive for developers or for people who own panels and perhaps sell that credit, those are also evolving. That program is being renamed. It's difficult to follow the evolution of all these programs or even understand what's out there. I think what's most important here, and we can circulate these slides after or point you to other educational materials, is to understand that only some of these benefits only some of these benefits directly reach all customers, And there are some customers who only benefit from some of these incentives. And so the ones tied up with net metering and the ones tied up with more that are most closely tied up with the accounting of your electricity bill if you are a solar customer and a bill payer, those ones are the ones that we're focusing on in terms of restoring or advocating for equity. But we are also looking at advocating through the state incentive process and through legislative mandate policies that would encourage developers to build more low-income and moderate-income solar projects. Next slide.
And okay, yeah, and I was just going to say for folks that we will put the slide deck and the recording of the webinar up on our website so that folks, if you want to, go back and take another look, if you're like, wait a minute, what was Joel talking about? You'll be able to check that.
So I talked about a little bit about some of the barriers people may face, but this slide goes through in just a couple of questions. And in addition to economics, which I think is the easiest one to understand, or the sort of the quality, whether your roof can physically support solar panels if there's a tree over it, there's some other issues. So again, two of them are laid out here. One is the net metering cap. Can solar projects that will serve you actually be built in your area? If you are running up against the net metering cap, for example, in the National Grid territory, this often happens. Let's say you are a renter in Worcester, and the area in Central Mass has hit the net metering cap. You both can't put solar in your roof, and they can't build solar that would serve you in a nearby area. So that is a problem. So the cap is a problem. But there's also other issues like credit scores. So if you look at community solar projects, if you look at different kinds of solar purchase agreements, they often have, there's a level of read the fine print here in general. You want to know what you're buying into, but there's also some companies that really aren't working with people who aren't creditworthy. And so we want to make sure projects get built and that there are companies out there that will work with people across sort of the income spectrum and who have been coming from different areas and frankly who may not have good credit scores. Language is one that's there, and we put that there because Clean Water's history on energy efficiency and with working with some predominantly communities of color group, we have found barriers to weatherization, not just through the economics, not just through housing types, but with communities understanding what offerings are available and having trusted messengers to bring those to them. So we view programs that are required to work with community organizations or strongly shaped so that there is a plan for community outreach, multilingual, through sort of trusted messengers, actually as a something that really the state should be obligated to do, and something that's required to kind of fully reach all communities. So when we're thinking about even if you're thinking about from an environmental perspective of really deeply weatherizing every home, of getting renewable energy to as many people as possible, just to reduce emissions, we believe it makes sense. Not to mention from sort of the social equity perspective, of working with numerous multilingual trusted community actors to promote, to walk people through the various steps of the different clean energy and energy efficiency programs. That's not something you can really directly solve in a solar incentive discussion, but we continue to frame the green economy in terms of solving barriers to access, and think it's critical that agencies like the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources be in a position where they're asked, what are you doing to reach these groups? Who are you working with? How are you going about it? So stop there. And I think the next slide is the last one. I might have actually gone over it already.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So very quickly, just so we can go to other speakers, there are two other issues I just want to touch on. One, let me do the second one first. One of the issues here is just like, how are you defining low income? So the easiest way to define low income in terms of low income solar would probably be going with what's called R2 customers. And this is basically if you look at who is already on a discounted electric bill rate, and can we align a solar policy with those actual electric customers. So people who have a subsidized rate or a discounted bill rate already, they're already registered with their utility companies. They have a relationship with their community action agency. If you're in Boston, that would be like ABCD or Action for Boston Community Development. There are others across the state. The problem with that is that there are both people who aren't signed up for that, and also there are people who are in need who are above that level, which is typically we would put at 60% area median income. So there's people at 61% area median income, right? And from our perspective, they also deserve access to weatherization, to renewable energy, et cetera, but they might not be able to afford it. So I believe you have to get a little bit more, you have to have a more expansive definition. It's also because there are, people who are on the discount rate and people who live in affordable housing and people who are renters, they all get slightly different sets, or actually significantly different sets of people, and we want to include as many as possible. So what's the definition you use in terms of equity? Is it low income? Is it is it a certain geographic area? Is it that is a complicated question. We have tried to address in this legislation by having a big tent. Or including a lot of people. Load zone is another major issue. So this is the top bullet in this slide. Basically, there are not only different utility companies, but because they are large enough to cover quite a wide geographic spread in Massachusetts, some of the investor-owned utilities, so like National Grid and Eversource primarily, have what's called different load zones. If you're in the Boston area, I think that's like the NEMA region, and then Western Mass people would be familiar with what is WMECO, still owned by Eversource, but it's a different. The electric rates there work differently. The consequence of this for solar is that let's say it might be easiest to speak from a Boston perspective. If someone is in Boston in Eversource territory, you go a little bit west, you have National Grid Electric Service. There's also more land and more availability to build large solar projects there. But you can't have a project in National Grid territory in the sort of Metro West area then transfer to a renter in Boston. It isn't set up so you can transfer credits in that way. So in theory, there could be an economic arrangement or an accounting practice to do this, but that problem has not been solved. And what it means is like you have certain areas, and the greater Boston area or the Boston area is a particular problem, but it's not the only example, where it's just very hard to find space to build the kinds of solar projects that would then work for the density of renters and low and moderate income populations that you have. So this is one of the issues we're going to have to solve if we want to actually get renewables to help reduce many people's bills. And with that, I will stop.
Great. Thanks, Joel. And I wanted to tell everybody, too, that at the end we're going to provide a link on the last slide. And also, obviously, you guys will get the slide deck and the link to this recording in an email later this week. But we'll have a link to the two-pager that has a short explanation of each bill, the sponsor for each bill, and the bill number. So bill numbers sometimes change, but sponsors don't. So we will provide that. So we're going to try again with Ben and see if we can get him back on in a way that is actually audible to the rest of us. Ben, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. I don't want to say yes quite yet, but yeah, you sound quite a bit better. Start talking and we'll let you know.
Okay. Thanks, Carol, and thank you so much to all of you for your patience. All right. So I missed the beginning of Joel's presentation, so hopefully I won't go over anything that he's already talked about. So to start off with a little bit of context, so folks know that Massachusetts is often seen as a leader for clean energy. And, it's certainly true that, looking among many other states, we are doing a lot more. So, we've seen rapid growth in solar power in Massachusetts. We're about to take big steps on offshore wind, and that's all great. That being said, clean energy is still a relatively small percentage of our overall electricity in Massachusetts. And right now we get only about 12% of our electricity from renewable sources like solar and wind. And obviously, if we're going to get where we need to get to in terms of solving climate change, we need to do a lot more, and we need to do it really quickly. So that's what these two policies that I'm going to talk about are really focused on, is accelerating the growth of renewable energy in Massachusetts and making sure that we're really getting where we need to get to in terms of reducing the carbon pollution that's driving climate change, and making sure Massachusetts is really leading the way forward with an ambitious and aggressive clean energy policy. Can folks still hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Excellent. That is so great. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about, I guess the main thread, is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or the RPS. And I think we can go on to the second slide if we aren't there already. So the RPS, folks may have heard of this. It's one of the most important policies in Massachusetts in terms of driving the growth of clean energy. Essentially, what the RPS, or the Renewable Portfolio Standard, is the requirement for the state's electric utility companies to buy a minimum percentage of their electricity from clean sources. And those are defined as so-called Class 1 renewable energy. So what that means is it's typically wind or solar, or sometimes some other technologies like anaerobic digesters count as well. And it needs to be based either in Massachusetts or another New England state, or one of the states that is bordering New England. So it has to be local, and it has to be really the kind of truly clean and renewable energy that we actually like. So that's what it is. And the requirement started at 1% of our electricity back in 2003, and it has slowly escalated over time to the point where it's now at 12%. And under current law, the RPS goes up by 1 percentage point each year. And that is basically, that's okay. I mean, it's great that it keeps increasing. But if you look out in the trajectory towards, 2030, 2040, 2050, it doesn't really get where we actually need to get to. So we can go on to the next slide. And the first bill I'm going to talk about is the bill that was introduced by Rep. Khan and Senator Mark Pacheco, which is the bill to accelerate the growth of the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So under this bill, the RPS would increase by 2% per year, so double the current rate of increase.
Should I have gone forward another slide? This is just the renewable, like the basics on the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Should I go forward one more?
Yeah, let's go to the next one. Sorry, I wasn't looking at my computer.
Okay, so this is the Pacheco and Khan one.
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Yeah. So this is, and I should say, this is one of several bills, at least 2 or 3 that's out there to increase the RPS. So, just so folks are aware, there are multiple proposals and multiple bills that are floating out there. This bill in particular would double the rate of increase of the RPS from 1 percentage point per year to 2 percentage points per year. And it would also include the municipal light plants. So as I think Joel mentioned earlier, most people in Massachusetts get their electricity from so-called investor-owned utility companies. That's usually Eversource or National Grid. There's a handful of communities, about 50 or so, that actually get their electricity from so-called municipal light plants, which are utilities that are owned by the local city or town. And those utilities, I think mostly for political reasons, have been historically exempt from the requirements of the RPS. So basically, there is no requirement for municipal light plants right now to purchase any renewable energy at all. And since they cover about 10 to 15% of the population in Massachusetts, that's a significant chunk of our energy that could be renewable but is not so far. So the Khan and Pacheco bill would require municipal light plants to be included in the RPS, and it sort of phases it in over time by 2030 to give them time to adjust. So that's the Pacheco and the Khan bill. And then we can move on to the next slide, which is a bill introduced by Senator Jamie Eldridge and Representative Paul Mark, an act relative to solar power and the green economy. You might ask yourselves, what is this doing in this section on the RPS? Well, I will tell you. So the bill does a couple things. One is that it sets a long-term target for solar energy growth. So it says we're going to get 17.5% of our electricity from solar power by 2025 and 25% of our electricity from solar by 2030. Worth noting that that's actually just a small percentage of our overall solar capacity in Massachusetts. And actually the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has estimated that we could get about 40 to 45% of our electricity in Massachusetts just by putting solar panels on every available rooftop in the state, without even any larger ground-mounted installation. So there's huge capacity out there. So this is just a small fraction of that. And then because actually if we were to achieve 25% solar in 2030, that would actually take up the entire, most of the existing growth in the RPS, right? So there would be no room for offshore wind or any of the other technologies that are coming online. So for that reason, when we were putting this bill together, we thought it was important to also include an increase in the RPS to make sure that solar is not the only thing that's happening, but is happening in complement to other technologies like offshore wind. And so this bill would increase the RPS by 2% next year and by 3% per year in each following year, which would be enough to get to 50% renewable electricity by 2030, and we'd hit 100% by about 2047. So I think that I will stop there in the interest of time, and then I'm happy to take any questions at the end if folks have them and if we have time.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and whip through back through Joel's slides, and we will get through carbon price. We will get to carbon pricing. So, Cindy, are you able to unmute yourself? Let's see. So I will go ahead and find her here in the list. Cindy, are you there? So, Cindy, are you able to unmute yourself from your side? You should be able to. All right, guys, sorry about this. Little bit of excitement in terms of the technology and the challenges therein. Cindy? Joel or Ben, could either of you let Cindy know how to unmute herself from her side?
Is she on her phone or on the computer?
So she's on her phone and on the computer, like any good belt and suspenders person. But
can you hear me now?
There we go. Yes.
Oh,
perfect.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I am really excited for this presentation because I'm also a very proud MCAN board member. So thank you, friends of MCAN and members of MCAN, for signing up for this and getting informed about these exciting bills that are gathering lots of momentum this session. So wanted to talk to you about carbon pricing, which are other people hearing an echo when I talk, or is it just on my phone?
There is a little bit of an echo. I don't know if it's possible for you to move away from your computer. That may be what's making it happen.
Is it better now?
No.
Sounds great to me.
Okay.
Okay, well, there we go.
Well, I'm just going for it then. Carbon pricing is a major priority of MCAN and Clean Water and a whole host of organizations who've joined together in the mass campaign for a clean energy future. And I know it can sound complicated, but the core concept here is that we're working to level the playing field with in-region, homegrown, clean energy alternatives and out-of-state fossil fuel sources of energy. Massachusetts has to import every single bit of coal and oil and gas that it burns here, and there's obviously a very unlevel playing field between the fossil fuels that are heavily subsidized and our local clean energy alternatives. So both these bills that you see before you, the Senate bill introduced by Mike Barrett, an act combating climate change, and the House bill introduced by Representative Jen Benson, both really work to do that and keep the thumb on the scale for in-region clean energy. So it's very exciting. Economists tell us that this is the most cost-effective way to promote zero carbon local clean energy, and that we can't meet the Global Warming Solutions Act unless the price on carbon goes economy-wide. Right now we have a price on electricity through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and this would bring in the home heating and transportation fuels sectors. So in summary, that's really what we're talking about here, and then the details go on from there. So Carol, do you want to hit the next slide? So this is also part of an international trend. Canada, Iceland, Ireland, Japan, dozens of nations have some form of carbon pricing. It is really the new normal internationally. All of Canada is moving in this direction. And as of this year, 50% of the world's GDP will come from regions and countries that have a form of carbon pricing. So this is us in Massachusetts and ultimately nationally working to catch up with that. Next slide. The one spot that is subnational, that has moved this forward, that is sort of like the equivalent of a state in our region, is British Columbia. And there's lots of analysis been done about their experience. They've kind of plateaued recently because they have a pause in their policy. But I think the most important lesson learned from their experience so far, which has been very positive, they've seen a 16% reduction in carbon pollution in their region, is that they've seen a 50% increase in their clean tech and clean energy markets because of this drive to locate, for clean energy companies to locate in British Columbia, because the signal has been sent. Many businesses are supporting this because they're seeking these kinds of signals to know where to locate and to thrive. So we want to make Massachusetts the first state in the nation that thrives in this same way. Next slide. So we have the great benefit of, as I said, not having an ounce of indigenous fossil fuel capacity in our state. So economically, we're exporting about $20 billion with a B, every single year to other economies in Texas, in Pennsylvania, in Saudi Arabia, in Colombia. And that is not benefiting our economy. So because of this shift, we are in the very enviable position to have carbon pricing work both from a climate responsibility perspective and from an economic perspective. So next slide. And the Campaign for a Clean Energy Future is working on this three-part strategy that both targets the House and the Senate for support, as well as the governor, because the Global Warming Solutions Act gives the state the option of moving ahead with putting a price on carbon. So we need to ultimately get the governor's support as well. And this is hugely important nationally because folks across the country are really hoping that in the era of Trump, that a bipartisan solution supported by Democratic legislators and a Republican governor can move forward. So these two bills essentially place a fee on fossil fuels, on the out-of-state fossil fuel companies when they work to bring fossil fuels over the border. The fee is based on the carbon content of the fuel. So it's more for coal, for example, than it would be for gas, and so on. The fees would then get collected into a fund, and each person in each business that has a certain number of employees would get a rebate. And both of these bills are set up so that the poorest and moderate income families in the state, the 60% lowest income families, would either come out ahead, meaning that the rebate would be slightly higher than the anticipated fees, the modeled fees that they would pay, or would at least break even. So that guards against, in the event that any fossil fuel companies try to pass the fees along to consumers, then people would be covered. And at the end of the day, fossil fuels from out of state and out of region would be more expensive than in-region clean energy alternatives. And that is the big systemic push that we're looking for to make all of the energy efficiency and renewable energy and public transit and, really advances in decarbonizing the economy work more quickly and more efficiently for us. So the coalition is supporting both these bills very enthusiastically. One interesting note, the Senate bill, Senator Barrett's bill, would simply put the fee on fossil fuels and then make sure that people and businesses get the rebate. So these out-of-state fossil fuel dollars would get transferred to the Massachusetts economy. Great. And that is all it would do. It provides some extra tools for businesses in the event that they're struggling with dealing with the fee. And it also gives more of a rebate to rural residents that have fewer resources and fewer choices for public transit. The Rep. Benson bill is very similar, but it also establishes a green infrastructure fund with 20% of the revenue that comes in. And that would be to support community-based green infrastructure projects like improved transit or improved efficiency in public buildings or tree planting or other work that would make communities more resilient in the face of extreme weather and climate change. From her perspective, it helps make sure that communities see direct benefits as well as change that economic incentive signal that local clean energy deserves to be on the level playing field with fossil fuels. So obviously this can get very complicated very quickly, but essentially both bills are very enthusiastically supported. They both protect low and moderate income families, and they both would get to a 5 to 10% overall pollution reduction, carbon pollution reduction, which is the biggest single reduction that any policy analyzed by the state in preparing the climate plan would produce. So bottom line, if we don't have a price on carbon, we will have a very, very hard time meeting our overall climate mandates. So that is why the coalition is really prioritizing this work. And I'll stop there and open up for questions with our other amazing advocates on the phone.
Great. So actually, before we do that, what we're going to do is we're just going to tell you guys a little bit more about kind of next steps. And I'm not sure if, Henrietta, are you able to unmute yourself again? I know that this is a little bit of a challenge.
Oh,
Henrietta,
no.
are you there?
Oh, yeah.
No, you're unmuted. Yeah, good.
Okay. Well, thanks to everybody for the presentations. I'm here to make the pitch for you to join the team and help us to get the message that these bills are important to the State House. What we're going to do is we're going to email you and ask for you to be a volunteer, and we want to know from you if you have some other folks you think might be interested. If you're part of a chapter, MCAN chapter, maybe you can get somebody in the chapter or a couple people to be the contact folks for legislation to alert other people. Generally speaking, as Carol said, the legislative session, it started in January and it'll go till a year from June. So it's a 1.5-year long cycle. And during that time, there'll be hearings, though none have been scheduled yet. And there may be some legislative briefings, and we'll tell you about those. We'll give you an idea of, what kind of action would be helpful at what time. And if you already know that you have a letter from your Board of Selectmen or City Council on these matters, if you could tell us, that would help. Another action you can take is on carbon pricing to sign your group onto a letter for the governor. So that's something else you might be able to do. So if you don't mind, we'll be in touch with you, and we'll give you some choices and some ways to get involved, and that's how we'll proceed from here. As Carol said, if you need to go back through the slides to kind of get yourself more familiar to see how, just to feel stronger about some of this legislation, that's going to be available at the MCAN site, I believe, and that could be helpful as well. And if there's anything else you can think of that we can do to help you to get sort of up and ready to do this work, just be in touch with us, and we'll work on that. So thank you for your interest, and look forward to working with you.
Thanks, Henrietta. And so what we're going to do is we'll send you guys an email over the next couple days, which will have a link to the slide deck and a link to the recording, and to ask you to join the team, or if there's anybody else in your town or chapter who you think would be good for this. And then so you can respond to us there. So if you look here on the slide that's up, you can find that link where everything, all the bill numbers and everything are on our webpage, and then there's also a 2-page printable version, and there's email address. So I'm very pleased to see that someone just put into the chat that there are members from several indivisible groups who are joining the webinar. I would love to talk to you guys separately, because I know that there is so much fabulous work happening in the indivisible groups, and we want to make sure that we've got all of the resources made available to you guys, and all of the institutional knowledge that comes from all of these groups. So please contact me separately, all of the indivisible people. And so I know that I've got a series of questions for some of the speakers. So what I'm going to do is I think what we'll do is we'll start out with, we've got a whole bunch of questions about the carbon pricing bill, but I think we'll start out then with a question for you about the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And somebody asked, are there special requirements as part of the Governor's Executive Order 569 or the Global Warming Solutions Act that impact the Renewable Portfolio Standard?
That is a great question. I am not aware of anything in the GWSA implementation that directly affects the RPS. I'm trying to think right now. I mean, so so there's a couple of things that have been brought up around the question of the RPS and whether to expand it. And just so folks know, the Baker administration so far has been very cool to the idea of expanding the RPS. And one of the arguments that they've made is that it is no longer necessary or as effective as it once was. And what they do is they point to other programs and policies the state has put in place, for example, requirement to procure a certain amount of offshore wind over the next 10 years and say, well, we already have this requirement to do offshore wind. We don't really need the RPS on top of that to actually drive the growth of renewables. And what we would say is that that's great that we have the offshore wind requirement, and we need the RPS to set the overall guideposts for the growth of renewable energy, and to drive additional resources that might not be covered in some of these large-scale procurements, like, for example, smaller-scale solar. So that's the kind of most immediate intersection I can think of with what the administration is doing. But I'm not sure. Joel, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No.
Okay. Short answer. So another question that we had, which may be one for you, Ben, is, for you, Joel, is how do these bills impact the demand response experiments that National Grid is doing?
This is Joel. I don't think that they do, and that isn't to say that. So there are a variety of energy interventions or whatnot that, efficiency, better management of the power grid, or reducing power from high energy users, large businesses that can dim their lights, or there are different ways of managing the energy grid that can potentially save us power at different times. There are kind of different ways of going about doing that. You can think about installing more advanced kinds of metering. You can have voluntary commitments from businesses. And there's also efforts at grid modernization. So there are legislative and regulatory policies around grid modernization, which I think is really where that would fall under. But that was not stuff we were covering today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Cindy, there was a question about carbon pricing. Is it structured so that it's priced per BTU or per pound of emissions? And a secondary question, is there any structure in either of the bills to give rebates for municipalities?
Okay, so it is set up per ton of emissions. And the, obviously, as I said, coal would have the highest, then oil, then gas, then fracked gas. And the House bill, which is a new bill this session. Last session there was no House vehicle focusing on carbon pricing, so we have our work cut out for us in educating members of the House around these issues. Thankfully, Rep. Benson is a powerhouse and in leadership and really well respected. So we're excited about potential this session. The House bill does set up a funding stream for municipalities so that there would be a way, in much the same way that the Green Communities Act sets up a funding stream for communities that sign up for the program and participate. The House version of carbon pricing would set up a funding stream for community-level green infrastructure and clean energy projects. And, there's a lot of very interested communities thinking about the potential of what could be $200 to $300 million a year in funds that could be generated that would be new and stimulating our clean energy economy locally. So there's a lot of thinking going on. There's also thinking going on with the Clean Energy Center around how this could be organized and streamlined and efficient, and really just another way to get resources to communities really wanting to focus on this. There's also, I think, for equity reasons and for environmental justice reasons, I'm very happy to report that there's a particular amount of these funds that would have to be spent in low-income communities of color. And there's a particular amount of funding that would be set aside for additional resources for low-income energy efficiency to help particularly renters in low-income communities access energy efficiency programs more effectively.
Fabulous. So I know that I said that this that this webinar was going to go until 9 o'clock. Because of our technology issues, we've gone a little bit long, and I'm actually going to keep us on until 1/4 which is just a couple minutes from now, just to give us an opportunity to answer a couple more questions. There was a question about, somebody asked, does it make sense to do any of this as ballot initiatives rather than as legislation? And I thought I would start answering the question, but I'm sure the rest of the speakers probably have opinions about that too. The thing that I find about, or the thing that is fairly acknowledged to be universally true about ballot initiatives, is that they are very expensive and very energy intensive, and if you it's much harder to get something done as a ballot initiative than it is to get it done as legislation. You have to start you basically have to start out with a really, really popular issue and get beaten down in the polls during the whole campaign season. So it's a much better idea, both in terms of efficiency and in terms of building up championship of the folks who are our elected officials to get things done at the State House whenever possible. Do any of our other speakers have any opinions or thoughts or about ballot initiatives?
I would just say for carbon pricing in particular, the T word, the tax word, which we have been counseled by communications professionals to never use when talking about carbon pricing, is such a difficult dynamic around ballot initiatives that we particularly would be worried about a ballot route in Massachusetts. I do know that some of our sponsors, our legislative sponsors, are aware that there could be, in the event that legislation passes this session, there could be a ballot initiative in response to that, and people are sort of pre-planning what the response could look like. But yes, absolutely, Carol is right. Unfortunately, the millions of dollars in ad money it would take to really effectively run this campaign, I think probably any of these campaigns, would be really hard to raise.
So we'll just do one last question, and Ben, this is probably for you. It's a question about whether the impact or hopefully non-impact of increasing the renewable portfolio standard, whether there is or is not an impact on low-income ratepayers.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, to take a step back and give maybe a little bit more detail about how the RPS works. So basically, as I mentioned, under the RPS, utilities are required to buy a certain amount of renewable energy. And essentially the way that they do that is by purchasing these renewable energy credits that are produced from qualifying renewable projects. And the funds that come to do that are from us, basically, from ratepayers. So it essentially adds a relatively small amount to our electric bills. So I think the short answer is, in some ways, it could increase the cost of electricity, particularly, and including in that low income as well as other ratepayers. On the flip side, I think the important thing to know about clean energy and the impact on electricity prices is two things. One is that the price is coming down all the time, right? And if you look at the cost of a solar installation today, it's half as much as it was 5 or 6 years ago, and it is continuing to decline, and to the point where clean energy is becoming economically competitive with fossil fuels. So I think that is one important thing to know. I think another important thing is that using renewables as opposed to fossil fuels can have an effect of stabilizing the price of electricity, right? So we've all experienced this problem over the last couple of years where the availability or the price of fossil fuels, tends to go up and down pretty dramatically. Whereas with renewables, right, once you build a solar panel or wind turbine, it's there and producing electricity basically for free, right? So there's no fuel cost. So I think in net, we think it is, so I think you have to weigh that against, whatever potential cost increases. I think it's something definitely, to be aware of, and it's something that is not, explicitly addressed in the legislation at this moment, the impact on low-income communities, but, it's definitely worth thinking about moving forward and looking at ways that we could potentially mitigate any impacts.
Great, thanks, Ben. So we're going to go ahead and close out tonight because we've kept you guys for a really long time. Thank you again for everybody for joining. Thank you for your patience through the technological issues that we had. And we're going to send all of you an email later this week, and I hope to hear from all of you that you're excited to work on this legislation and that we can get this done. So thank you so much to the speakers, and thank you to all the attendees. Good night.